Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Memoria Misera Extreme. This is the brand new Extreme trial made available by the new relic quest chain in patch 5.2 in Final Fantasy XIV. ALEA's party finder strats may vary from data center to data center, so for now we're going to focus on the strats I've seen the most on Primal. Before we begin though, a joke. How old do you think Varus is in this memory? I'd say about FORTIUS. My name is Miztech, and I'll be your trial guide. To truly understand this fight, players need to first learn the difference between Varus's regular attacks and his gunshield attacks. Anytime the boss casts a gunshield attack, you'll notice a charge bar appear. The actual gunshield attack will be delayed until the bar reaches 100. This delay causes a specific overlap of each gunshield attack with Varus's regular attacks, and I recommend players keep an eye on this charge bar throughout the entire encounter until you get used to the pattern. Before we dive in, let's take a look at each possible gunshield attack. Electrified gunshield will knock back all players a set distance from the boss. Should you get pushed into the outer edge of the platform, you'll be stunned for a short time, debuffed, and confined into a memory rock that must be destroyed before it kills you to return to the fight. Since this is a huge pain in the ASEAN, you can avoid this completely by using your knockback immunity when the charge bar hits 85 or 90. Loaded gunshield will target all players with large circle attacks. These attacks must be spread apart, and players can assign clock positions to avoid overlapping with one another. Reinforced gunshield will form two shields on opposite side of the boss that will knock back and apply nasty debuffs on any players that hit them. As the charge bar is nearing 100, players will need to be careful not to hit the boss as the shields are forming. They'll then move to the safe open sides of the boss before resuming their attacks. Now that we've covered each gunshield attack, let's look at the encounter itself. We begin with ALEA. This is a high damage raid-wide blast that will also form white terminus X's on each player in the direction that they're facing. These will soon blast out in long straight line attacks in the direction that they form. To control how these drop, all players but the main tank can stand behind the boss. This will force each terminus X to shoot towards the north and south directions only. IACTA S begins with 4 room-wide 180-degree attacks directly in front of him and ends with one final room-wide attack behind him. Since players are stacked south behind the boss for the initial bait of the X's, they can stay there until the boss begins to cast ALEA, then quickly move behind him to the northeast or northwest. After the first 4 hits, players can then move to the opposite side of the boss in the southwest or southeast to avoid the final attack. This positioning also ensures that each player is out of the path of the terminus X's, which will resolve immediately after. Next up, Sidious is a heavy-hitting tankbuster cleave that can be split between both tanks with cooldowns or taken solo with an immunity. The group can reposition behind the boss here to avoid getting cleaved. Immediately after, the boss will turn to a random player and cast Ignis Est. This attack begins with a short telegraph in the direction of a random player. This part of the attack can be baited, and to keep that consistency, the group will stack in the south to do so. Ignis will eventually cause a large point-blank AoE around the boss plus a long line attack in the direction of that original telegraph. The inner circle pattern on the ground is roughly the size of the point-blank attack, and players can use this to help with their positioning. At the same time, both healers will be targeted with these stack-up markers. Divide the raid in 2 and assign a stack spot outside of the Ignis circle attack to share this safely. Next up, the boss will leap into the middle and cast Electrified Gunshield. Players will need to be ready for this incoming knockback. The boss will then cast ALEA, and the group will stack in the south again to bait the terminus X's. After ALEA, the group will remain in the south to bait the incoming Ignis cast. As soon as that cast begins, players can begin to move out of the inner circle to dodge the incoming Ignis point-blank circle and line AoEs. The knockback will resolve immediately after the Ignis attacks go out, and all players can use their knockback immunities at around 85 on the charge bar. If you don't have a knockback immunity, you'll need to move into melee range as soon as the Ignis attacks resolve to avoid getting knocked into the wall. Next up, the boss will cast Reinforced Gunshield. Once the charge bar reaches 100, all players will need to adjust to the shields around the boss. But before that happens, the boss will cast another tank buster. Don't forget your cooldowns and make sure you're not standing in front unless you're a tank. Immediately after the tank buster, the shields will form around the boss for about 3 seconds. Careful not to get greedy and reposition to the open safe sides if necessary before resuming your attacks. As soon as the shields are down, the group can reposition behind the boss again. The boss will then cast Loaded Gunshield followed by VENTUS S. cast. Ventus begins in the same manner as Ignis, with a short telegraph baited onto a random player. Since the group is stacked behind the boss in the south, this too will be baited towards the south. Along with the line attack towards the originally baited telegraph, Ventus will target the entire room except the size of the inner circle around the boss. Once the initial telegraph is baited, all players can spread to their clock positions, ensuring that they stay close to the boss to avoid the Ventus donut attack. As soon as that Ventus attack resolves, all players can then continue into their assigned spots to spread the incoming loaded gun shield attacks. At this point, the boss will begin to cast Vivere Militare Est, and a short cutscene will play. Two Blades pulsed objects will form in the center of the platform. The tanks can pop some mild cooldowns and interact with one blade each. This will throw them into an active time maneuver, and they'll need to spam their buttons for the duration of the event. Healers will need to keep an eye on the tanks during this time, as they're also affected by an extra bleed. Everyone else will target and destroy the BLADESBLOOD that spawns in the center of the room. There is also a lot of raid-wide damage going off at this time, so healers be ready. The group will need to destroy the BLADESBLOOD before the boss finishes his cast, or you will die. Top everyone off and get ready for the second phase. In this phase, the boss will cast 3 sets of mechanics that accompany a specific gun shield attack in a random order. Each gun shield mini phase will have the same mechanic set every time, but the order that each mini phase occurs will be random. During Electrified Gun Shield, the boss will cast reinforcements. This will cause 3 targetable Magitech turrets and 2 untargetable turrets to spawn around the platform. The untargetable turrets will tether onto random players. Each tank can intercept these tethers and take the incoming damage instead. Healers beware. The other 3 Magitech turrets will throw out long AoE line attacks and can be easily destroyed. At the same time, a number of clones will appear on the north edge of the platform. The order in which they appear is random, but there will always be one safe lane formed. The raid will destroy the 3 Magitech turrets as quickly as possible while making their way into the safe lane. Immediately after the X lane attacks resolve, the charge bar will hit 100 and the boss will knock back all players. As such, all players will need to be ready to use their knockback immunity at this time. As soon as these AoE attacks resolve, players can move back behind the boss to bait the next cleave attack. As soon as the ALEA cast begins, players will move behind him to avoid the 4 cleaves before moving back to avoid the final single cleave. This is the end of the Electrified Gun Shield mini phase. During Loaded Gun Shield, the raid will stack behind the boss to again bait Ignis to the south. As soon as that initial telegraph forms, each player can then move to their assigned clock positions outside of the inner circle to avoid the Ignis attacks. Clones will form on the northern edge of the platform and a single safe lane will be created. As soon as the Loaded Gun Shield burst goes off on each player, they can all move into that safe lane. While they do so, the 2 healers will be targeted for another round of stack up markers. To handle this, you can have one stack in the south part of the safe lane, while the other stack groups up in the north part of the safe lane. Up next, the boss will cast another tank buster. Make sure the group repositions behind the boss while the tanks soak the buster with appropriate cooldowns. This tank buster also marks the end of the Loaded Gun Shield mini phase. During Reinforced Gun Shield, the raid will stack behind the boss to bait Altius. Heal through that AoE damage and stay in your position until Ventus begins to cast. Be careful not to move too early here to ensure a proper bait. As soon as the telegraph forms, players can move to the sides of the boss to avoid the Terminus X attacks. At this point, the reinforced shields will form around the boss and players will need to reposition on the safe side away from the Ventus telegraph, while also staying close to the boss to avoid the second aspect of Ventus, the room-wide donut attack. This is followed by another tank buster, which again marks the end of this mini phase. Once all 3 rounds of Gun Shield mini phases resolve, the boss will teleport to the north edge of the platform and begin to cast a slow Altius. A gun shield will form in front of him that must be destroyed before this cast goes off, or you will die. The gun shield itself will then cast Magitech Spark and Magitech Torch in a random order. Spark is an 8-point cleave on every player that deals a massive amount of damage and debuffs any player as it hits. To avoid overlap, the raid will need to fan out in front of the boss. Torch is a massive amount of damage that is shared by everyone in the raid. Line up with your tanks in front of the shield to share that damage. After these 2 attacks, there will be no more raid-wide damage in this phase, and all players can focus on destroying the shield. Once the shield is down, the boss will return to the center and the third and final phase begins. He begins by casting Loaded Gun Shield. Again, this won't resolve for a while, but keep your eye on that charge bar. Immediately after, the boss will cast FORTIUS, and a clockwise or counterclockwise telegraph will form around him. This will cause persistent puddles to drop on all players, and 4 rounds of 8-point cleaves will go out in succession that will rotate around the boss in the direction of that original telegraph. To handle this easily, players can use their same assigned positions from the previous phases. As FORTIUS is casting, all players will move to their clock positions and drop their puddle on the edge of the platform. As soon as that puddle drops, they'll also be hit by the first unavoidable cleave and they can move back into towards the boss. The second cleave will then rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise, and all players can stay in their positions to easily avoid it. As soon as that second cleave resolves, they can all move either left or right into the area of the second cleave to avoid the third cleave. Once the third cleave goes out, they can then move back into their original position to avoid the fourth and final cleave. This movement allows each player to end up back in their original clock position, perfectly spread to avoid the incoming loaded gun shield attack. Once that attack goes off on each player, the two healers will again be marked for stack up. Players will stack in the east and west with their assigned groups to share the damage. Next up, the boss will begin to cast Electrified GUNSHIELD, and clones will appear on the northern edge of the platform, forming a single safe lane. Players can identify the safe lane, but will not be moving into it just yet. The boss will cast a second FORTIUS, and all players will again move to their assigned positions to drop off their puddles and dodge the 4 rounds of rotating cleave attacks in the same manner. As soon as the cleaves resolve, all players can then move into the safe lane. With the timing, players can use their knockback immunities here to avoid the incoming Electrified GUNSHIELD knockback that occurs immediately after. Players will then return to their bait position behind the boss. ALEA will cast, and another round of clones will appear on the north edge, forming another safe lane. Immediately after the ALEA cast, the two healers will be targeted for their stack-up markers. To handle this, the group will split in their assigned groups and stack in the north and south sides of the safe lane. As soon as that healer's stack damage goes off, players will have a tiny amount of time to reposition behind the boss to bait the next VENTUS. The boss will then cast another ALEA attack, and all players must move behind him to avoid the first 4 cleaves. Once the first 4 cleaves go off, players can move to the opposite side of the boss, making sure they stay close to melee to avoid getting hit by the VENTUS donut. You'll also need to make sure you're not in the path of any of the Terminus X's, as they'll all go off at the same time. As you can see, in this phase, consistent baiting is essential to success. You want to give yourself as much room to work with when these mechanics start to overlap like crazy. This is followed by another tank buster. Don't forget those cooldowns. Next up, the boss will jump into the center and cast Ignis. Remember to reposition directly behind him to bait the Ignis south. This is immediately followed by another ALEA cast that can also be baited towards the south. Move behind him during the cast and be ready to move to the opposite side to avoid that final attack. The trick here is that the Ignis cast will go off right after the final ALEA attack, and players will need to make sure they're out of the inner circle to avoid getting hit by this extra step. At this point, the boss will cast another loaded gun shield followed by FORTIUS. This is the exact same combo as the beginning of the phase and is handled in the exact same manner. Once this combo resolves, the boss will cast one final Enrage ALEA. Depending on your raid damage, it's possible to skip a large portion of this last phase, but if you don't kill him before this final ALEA cast goes off, you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Happy farming. Till next time.